Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something absolutely fascinating and honestly deeply empowering. We're talking about the hidden psychology of becoming completely impossible to control. Have you ever wondered what's actually going on inside the mind of someone who just cannot be manipulated? Well, we're going to break down the exact psychological shift that makes a person literally immune to external control.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just picture the dynamic shift for a second. Imagine someone who heavily relies on controlling or predicting your every move suddenly hitting a brick wall. On the surface, they're running their usual textbook social plays, right? They're throwing out guilt trips, applying that subtle emotional pressure, or trying to constantly shift expectations just to throw you off balance. But instead of getting that fearful or compliant reaction they are completely banking on, they are met with just a calm, unshakable presence. The contrast here is wild. You have their desperate, calculated tactics crashing headfirst into your new, completely unbothered reality. And man, this is the exact moment a manipulator realizes their entire playbook is useless. They can no longer control you. But how exactly do you reach that state?
Well, it starts with what we call the psychological pivot. You see, interpersonal control doesn't just happen by magic. A manipulator's leverage relies entirely on exploiting our deeply ingrained human vulnerabilities. For their tactics to work, they literally need you to react in highly predictable ways. And this brilliantly illustrates the three main things they target: our desperate need for social approval, our intense fear of uncertainty, and that automatic habit we all have of seeking immediate comfort. But here's the kicker. When you take the time to rewrite these internal patterns, you essentially pull the rug right out from under them. Their leverage, it completely evaporates. So let's look at the 5 pillars for doing exactly that.
Which brings us to Pillar 1, escaping external validation.
Think about it. So many controllers rely on social trends, group enthusiasm, or the promise of constant validation to steer your behavior. They desperately want you to believe your security is tied directly to their approval. But chasing external validation is a totally frantic state to live in. Once you develop a low need for it, inward processing becomes this quiet superpower. You actually start to prefer experiencing things privately. You begin valuing genuine immersion way over some flashy social display. You get totally comfortable standing out, making decisions independently just based on your own personal interests. And because you process your values inwardly, controllers can no longer use the threat of social rejection to manipulate your actions. You simply don't need their applause anymore.
Let's see how this builds right into Pillar 2, the power of observation.
You know, people who are easily controlled often feel this intense, overwhelming pressure to talk, like this urgent need to fill every single awkward pause in a room. But there's a fundamental rule of social dynamics we have to remember. Talking gives information out, but listening brings information in. By choosing your words carefully and actually taking a beat to process details internally before you speak, you're protecting your inner world. You completely stop handing the manipulator the raw data they need to figure out your weak spots.
Now, what's really interesting about this quiet strategy is how incredibly practical it is. First, you just speak less. Second, you process internally. And third, you connect the signals. While you're staying quiet, you're observing. You're quietly watching their behavior, their tone, those tiny subtle reactions. Instead of emotionally reacting to whatever they're saying, you take all these separate signals and connect them into one clear pattern. It's almost like a giant puzzle, and putting it together allows you to accurately interpret their real motives before they even finish their sentence.
Moving on to Pillar 3, radical personal ownership.
So a classic manipulation tactic you'll see from emotionally immature people is blame shifting. They'll blame bad luck, their boss, their family, really anything to protect their fragile egos from uncomfortable truths. And they fully expect everyone else to just step in and carry the weight of adulthood for them. But the absolute second you take absolute ownership of your life and choices, you become immune to their finger-pointing. You start treating mistakes and those super awkward moments just as feedback, not as some devastating attack on your personal identity. Because your ego isn't tied up in having to be perfect, their criticism completely loses the power to trigger your defensiveness or shame. You own your reality, leaving zero room for them to distort it.
Next up, Pillar 4 requires us to look at our brain's baseline programming, embracing the unknown.
Look, the human brain naturally prefers what feels familiar because predictability creates a really powerful sense of psychological safety. And controllers, they rely heavily on this mere exposure effect to keep you boxed into a stagnant cycle of familiar discomfort. They know your mind is highly tempted to choose the devil you know over the devil you don't. But uncertain opportunity, that is the space where actual growth happens. When you consciously build up a high tolerance for uncertainty, you accept that the process of growing is just going to feel a bit uncomfortable. And the moment you accept that discomfort, their ability to keep you trapped in that familiar cycle completely breaks down.
And finally, we arrive at Pillar 5, control your emotional reactivity.
Manipulators are absolute experts at trying to trigger what's called early obsession. They'll shower you with validation or promise these instant, life-changing transformations just to get you emotionally hooked. Basically, they want to trick your brain into mistaking their promised potential for actual reality. Why? Because it causes you to rush ahead just to reduce the anxiety of the unknown. So the crucial point here is that your defense against this is making decisions based on hard evidence, not temporary moods. When you learn to make choices without letting fleeting emotions like fear, frustration, or even intense excitement dictate your moves, their control is shattered. You patiently observe reality, you look for hard evidence of past challenges you've successfully survived, and suddenly, your brain starts anticipating their shifts before they even become visible.
We've covered all 5 pillars, which brings us to the grand shift, the unshakable foundation.
So, what does this internal transformation actually look like in practice, when it all finally clicks? When someone realizes they can't control you, it's not because you've morphed into some cold, aggressive monster. Not at all. This kind of immunity is built on self-awareness and cognitive flexibility. You haven't become unfeeling. Actually, scratch that. You've just built a stronger, more honest foundation. You have successfully stepped out of survival mode. You're no longer just reacting to pressure. You're actively building your future through deliberate, independent actions.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to really chew on. Will you let the fear of the unknown dictate your potential? Becoming impossible to control starts with a single choice, the choice to step into uncertainty and reclaim your psychological habits. If you love geeking out on the hidden psychology behind everyday human behavior, make sure to hit subscribe. Because honestly, once you start understanding these small things that shape people's lives, you begin noticing patterns everywhere that most people completely overlook. Thanks so much for joining me for today's explainer, and I will catch you in the next one.